بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. واعلموا أن الله يحول بين المرء وقلبه وأنه إليه تحشرون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Every soul in this universe, whether it belongs to a human being which is old or young, male or female, whatever background and whatever ethnicity you can think of, the soul of that person searches for happiness. And this is illustrated in the Quran. In Surah Yasin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Salamun qawlan min Rabbin Rahim." And this verse, Salamun qawlan min Rabbin Rahim, illustrates what will happen on the Day of Judgment. After the judgment is carried out, and when the soul is ready to receive its final verdict, what it strives for most is salam, and that is peace and tranquility. And that represents peace with others and peace with the self. In this world, to live sin-free and guilt-free, and on the Day of Judgment to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the same fashion. Guilt-free and sin-free. Salam. A word which revolves around our lives, or which our lives revolve around. And even when it comes to the meaning of the word Islam, a more appropriate meaning, usually the word Islam is associated with taslim, meaning to surrender. But a more appropriate association to this word would be salam, peace. And that is what Islam, the essence of Islam, is based upon. Salamun qawlan min Rabbin Rahim. In another verse in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهِ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. That no wealth and no family shall benefit him on that day. The only thing which will benefit him is if he approaches Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a qalb, a heart and a soul which is salim, full of peace, guilt-free and sin-free. But in order to understand the mechanics of these verses, because in many times Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran refers to the qalb, and in the Arabic language the word qalb means heart. However, in the context of the Quran, it does not refer to the organ, the heart which is in our chest, which pumps oxygen and blood into our bodies. What it is associated with is the soul. And in order to understand what it means to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a guilt-free and a sin-free conscience, we must understand first the mechanics of the soul. Until now, science has not been able to prove exactly what the soul is. When is the soul created? We could, according to the ahadith and according to the Quran, determine, like I mentioned yesterday, when the soul enters the body, when it exits the body. But however, we have no idea when was the soul created, and when does it diminish completely? When does it cease to exist? The soul is one of those things which we believe in as our belief in the unseen. الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ. Those who believe in the unseen. The soul falls under this category, the unseen. But there are a few things which we do understand about the soul. Number one is the relationship between the soul and the body. The soul superimposes on the body. Meaning what? meaning the emotions that you feel, sometimes they could be felt by the soul without being felt by the body. For instance, sometimes your soul feels happiness, it feels strength, but that doesn't necessarily mean your body is feeling strength. Just like in Ramadan when you are fasting. When you are fasting, it's quite the contrary. Your body is feeling weak, not strong at all, but in return, your spirit is feeling very strong. When you wake up to pray for salat al-subh, it requires lots of struggle from your body. It requires lots of strength from your body. But however, once you stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, spiritually you are satisfied and spiritually you are feeling strong. So more emphasis is placed on the feelings of your soul than the feelings of the body. And that's why some scholars have suggested that even when it comes to retribution, reward and punishment, on the Day of Judgment, the focus is placed on rewarding and punishing not the body but the soul. Imam Ali alayhi salam in Dua Kumail, he says, فَهَبْنِي صَبَرْتُ عَلَىٰ عَذَابِكَ فَكَيْفَ أَصْبِرُ عَلَىٰ فِرَاقِكَ. That perhaps, my Lord, I will be able to handle the torment of my body, the weakness of my body, the torture of my body. However, what I cannot handle is the torment of my soul. I cannot handle the separation from you, O Allah. This means that the feeling of our soul superimposes on the feeling of our body. This is one aspect. The second aspect is that when it comes to significance, when it comes to dignity and honor, although the human being as a body, it is honored. That's why even when a person passes away, it is recommended that he who prepares the body for burial does so in a dignified way, in an honored way. However, if we are comparing the body to the soul, we find there is more significance to the soul than there is to the body. That's why this picture is illustrated in the Quran. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the creation of the human being, He says to the angels, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي خَالِقٌ بَشَرًا مِنْ صَلْصَالٍ مِنْ حَمَإٍ مَسْنُونٍ Surah Al-Hijr. He says to the angels that I have created a being, bashar, a being, a terrestrial being, from what? مِنْ صَلْصَالٍ مِنْ حَمَإٍ مَسْنُونٍ. The word hama in the Arabic language refers not to regular dirt, but the dirt that you would find in the swamps, slime. And this represents the lowest kind of dirt which has no value, not even regular dirt, slime, something that has no value to anybody. Then he says, فَإِذَا سَوَّيْتُهُ وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي فَقَعُوا لَهُ سَاجِدِينَ. Only after I bestow my soul, سَوَّيْتُهُ, I completed it. And by completing it what? نَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. I have bestowed the soul into it. فَقَعُوا لَهُ سَاجِدِينَ. Then, O angels, you shall prostrate to this being. So the being without the soul has no special significance. And this is illustrated in the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He says, look at the human. Before he is created, he is taken from semen, which is impure. When he is alive, he carries all forms of impurities inside him. All forms of impurities. And when he dies, his corpse becomes one big impurity, najasa. He says in another hadith, look at the human being, how low he is. His favorite thing to consume is honey, which is the excrement of a bee. And his favorite thing to wear is silk, which is the excrement of a worm. So the human being, if you're speaking about his body, is najasa, impurity, and he enjoys excrements. This is the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Without the soul, there is no honor. This is another aspect. And the third aspect, in regards to the relationship between the soul and the body, is that the body is only a tool. And the same way that you can use a tool to hurt somebody, a knife for instance, you can use a knife to hurt someone, in that same fashion, that knife can be turned against you. And your body is only a tool to carry out the commands of your soul and the desires of your soul. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that on the day of judgment, before your soul begins to admit its sin, before the book is presented, the book of deeds is presented among you or in front of you, your own body, which is the tool that you used for your desire, will witness against you. يَوْمَ تَشْهَدُ عَلَيْهِمْ أَلْسِنَتُهُمْ وَأَيْدِيهِمْ وَأَرْجُلُهُمْ بِمَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. That on that day, their hands begin to speak. Their legs begin to speak. The body, which is a tool, it begins to speak. The same way you used it as a tool for your desires, it shall turn against you. And the body is only a tool for the emotions. That's why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when it came to the funeral procession of his son Ibrahim, the Prophet, according to ahadith, had 3 or 4 sons, but none of those sons lived past the age of childhood. One of his sons was Ibrahim, who was from his wife Maria al-Qibtiyya, and Ibrahim was very dear to him. When he died, the Muslims performed a funeral procession. So it is narrated that one of the companions turned to Rasulullah and he saw that the Prophet was not weeping. So the Prophet turned to him and he pointed to the mountain. He said, if this mountain knew the sadness and the sorrow that was in my heart, it would crumble into pieces. Just because I'm not weeping does not mean that I do not have sorrow in my heart. And he said something very important. He said, إِنَّ الْقَلْبَ لَيَحْزَنُ. He said that the heart may feel sorrow. وَالْعَيْنَ لَتَدْمَعُ. That your eyes may draw tears. وَلَا نَقُولُ إِلَّا مَا يُرْضِي اللَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى. He says that your heart may feel sorrow and your eyes may draw tears, but we say nothing which displeases Allah. What does that mean? Crying and sorrow is a matter of emotions. Sometimes you can't control it. You see something on TV and automatically your heart feels sorrow. Even if that person is your enemy. Imagine you see your enemy being murdered or slaughtered in a very vicious manner. What happens to you? Even though he's your enemy, your heart might feel sorry for him. And you might not be able to hold your tears back. Sometimes we cannot hold our tears back. But the Prophet is telling us there is something that you can hold back, and that is what? Your tongue. You can hold your tongue. This tells us that emotions, sorrow, sadness, sympathy, empathy, all of that does not come from the body which we can control. It comes from the soul which sometimes we cannot control. So these are 3 different aspects of the soul, which is referred to in the Quran as al-qalb. And to prove that the word qalb in the Quran refers to the soul and not to the heart, there are different verses. One verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the concept of giving and taking alone. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا تداينتم بدين إلى أجل مسمى فاكتبوه وليكتب بينكم كاتب بالعدل. That if you are to take and receive alone, sit down and write it. Something which is overlooked. Sometimes people come to me and they say, well, you know, I gave my brother or my cousin or this person or that person $5,000, $10,000 and I trusted him and he's not paying it back and I have no way to prove that I have given him this so that I can use it against him. Well, you have gone against the orders of the Quran. The Quran says that if you give dayn, if you give a loan, then sit down and write it. وَلْيَكْتُبْ بَيْنَكُمْ كَاتِبٌ بِالْعَدْلِ. Bring someone who is trustworthy to write it down. And have people also witness it. Perform shahada, testimony. And then in the end of the ayah, he says, وَمَنْ يَكْتُمْهَا. He who hides it, shahada, the testimony, فَإِنَّهُ آثِمٌ قَلْبُهُ. He says that his heart has performed ithm, has performed disobedience. There is no meaning for the literal heart to perform disobedience. The heart is just an organ. The body is just a tool. It is the soul which receives this attribute, athim. Likewise, in another verse, In Surah Al-Ahzab, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, مَا جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لِرَجُلٍ مِّن قَلْبَيْنِ فِي جَوْفِهِ. He said that God has not created two hearts in one man. Now the case can be argued that people have been born, scientifically this has been proven, people have been born with two hearts inside of them. So this disproves the ayah in the Quran. We say no. The word qalb refers to the soul, meaning that God has not placed two souls in one body, not two hearts in one body. So now that we have established this, some of the aspects of the soul, and that the soul is referred to as qalb in the Quran, and qalb does not mean hearts, rather it refers to the soul, we come to this verse. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَحُولُ بَيْنَ الْمَرْءِ وَقَلْبِهِ وَأَنَّهُ إِلَيْهِ تُحْشَرُونَ. That God comes between a man and his qalb, and his heart. And there are a couple of commentaries on this verse. One commentary states that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in all of our affairs, this is a general rule, that in all of our affairs, Allah has complete ownership. And whatever ownership that you have of either your property or your own body, of your emotions, anything is relative. It's not absolute. The only absolute milkiyah, ownership, belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does that mean? It means that if I own my house, my home, my house, is in my relative ownership, nisbiyah. I just own a portion. The absolute ownership goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, if I have a car, if I have a business, if I have the clothes on my back, this, although I'm making use of it, God allows me to make use of it because I have partial ownership, relative ownership. However, the absolute ownership goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is why we say, Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. That to Him we belong and to Him we return. Emotions, our soul, and the stability of our soul is also owned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does this mean? That although we may have some control over our emotions, who we love, who we hate, who we like, who we dislike, who we feel sympathy for, who we feel empathy for, but at the end of the day, the real ownership of those emotions goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning that even if I fall in love with somebody, there is a chance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes and makes me forget about that person. وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَحُولُ بَيْنَ الْمَرْءِ وَقَلْبِهِ وَأَنَّهُ إِلَيْهِ تُحْشَرُونَ. That God comes between a man and his heart, and his soul, and his emotions. They say that love is blind, correct? Sometimes you find a young man or a young woman, they fall in love with each other. And they say, I have no explanation for this love. My heart is just attached to this person. Love is blind. And I've seen it where a person, a young man, he falls in love with a woman and he thinks about her day and night, and all he wants to do is communicate with her, and he has to marry her. It doesn't matter what she looks like. She may have, this is wrong with her and that is wrong with her, but he can't prove why he loves her. He says, my heart is just attached to this person. And then you see him a year later and he's completely forgotten about it. This happens all the time. Especially when people are young and they don't use their intellect and they're all about love and they're all about heart, and their hormones are racing and their emotions are racing, and they just want to attach themselves to someone because it's the cool thing to do, or it's the popular thing to do. Well, guess what? No matter how much you think you love somebody, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the ability, according to the Quran, to come between you and that object of love and take that love out of your heart. This is why you can never be blamed for your heart being attached to something. However, Islam comes and guides us and tells us what to fall in love with and who to fall in love with. There are proper objects of love, correct objects of love, and there are incorrect objects of love. For instance, something which you fall in love with and you love, but that thing cannot love you back. Like what? Your house. You love your house, but can your house love you back? No, because your house has no emotions. You love your car, but can your car love you back? No, it doesn't have emotions. I read a report saying that It was a long time ago, I don't remember the exact number, but definitely more than 50 or 60% of people have an emotional attachment with their car. Meaning if something happens to their car, they get upset. Now it's normal. If, God forbid, you get into a car accident, your car gets totaled, that you're upset because, this is what you own and you don't want what you own to go to waste. However, some people, they take it a step further and they love their car and they give their car a name, and when they're washing the car, they're cleaning it, they're talking to it, and they start talking to it like it's a female. Correct? You've seen this. There's an actual physical or emotional attachment to that car. But can that car ever love you back? No, because it's an object. Can a pet, a dog or a cat, ever love you back? No. It may like you, but it cannot love you back the same way that you love it, the same way that you get attached to it. This is what it means when we speak of refining the objects of our love. We love what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us to love. First, it is Him, Rasulullah, Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, and then everything else comes second. Your family, your friends. Those are correct objects of love. Your family is your correct object of love. Your good friend, not your bad friend, your good friend is also a correct object of love. But ask yourself, if I'm attached to something, and according to Islam, this is not the correct object of love. A girl which I am not supposed to fall in love with. A guy who I'm not supposed to fall in love with. And there's an easy way to tell. I'll give you a perfect way. A perfect way. If you fall in love with someone, ask yourself, does this person fear God? If he does fear God or she does fear God, then you can continue. If they don't fear God, then don't even continue. Why? Because a person who fears God, you have nothing to fear from that person. A person who does not fear God, you have everything to fear from that person. This is what the true object of love is. وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَحُولُ بَيْنَ الْمَرْءِ وَقَلْبِهِ وَأَنَّهُ إِلَيْهِ تُحْشَرُونَ. So ask yourself right now, in private, ask yourself, if there's something that I love or someone that I love that my family does not approve of, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not approve of, and you're saying to yourself, well, my heart is attached, how do I get rid of this love? The only way to get rid of that love is to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and tell Him, oh Lord, if this is not the proper object of love, then take it out of my heart. If it is the proper object of love, then keep it in my heart. That's the best way. That's the best way to deal with your emotions. Nobody's telling you, don't fall in love. Nobody has the right to tell you not to fall in love or have your heart attached to something. Because that's a faculty of your emotions. Sometimes you don't even have control. But you do have control of pleading to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who has complete ownership of yourself and your emotions. This is one meaning of the verse. Another meaning of the verse, as per the commentary of our sixth Imam, Al-Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, he says that this verse, وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَحُولُ بَيْنَ الْمَرْءِ وَقَلْبِهِ وَأَنَّهُ إِلَيْهِ تُحْشَرُونَ, means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His infinite compassion and His infinite mercy and His love for us, He comes between you and your emotions, and He allows you to distinguish between right and wrong. And again, this goes back to your heart being attached to something. Ask yourself next time, if you love something, ask yourself, if only my heart says yes and my brain says no, don't go after it. But if both my heart says yes and my brain says yes, then that is a green light. And that's exactly why we have the intellect. The reason why we have the intellect is to tell us that this is what you're allowed to fall in love with, and this is what you're not allowed to fall in love with. Because going back to the last tafsir, the last commentary, love is blind. The only thing which is not blind is a brain, your perception, your comprehension. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes between a man and his emotions and allows him to tell the difference between right and wrong. Now when it comes to the qalb, a third aspect, a third issue, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sometimes, in some instances in the Quran, mentions the disease of the heart. فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ مَرَضٍ فَزَادَهُمُ اللَّهُ مَرَضًا. That their souls are tainted with a disease and with sickness. And what does this refer to? This refers to a couple of things. One is what is stated in the Quran. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل أعوذ برب الناس ملك الناس إله الناس من شر الوسواس الخناس الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس من الجنة والناس. And this disease comes in the form of an abundance of doubt. And this doubt, it terrorizes us. And where does it come? It comes straight to the heart. الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس. Goes straight to your heart. This is how the shaitan targets us. He knows that our qalb, which is not stable and requires someone or something to stabilize it, just like an unstable compound you learn in chemistry. In order to stabilize, you have to add another compound to it. You have to add another chemical. The heart is in the exact same way. When it is unstable, you place it in the hands of someone who is stable, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Unfortunately for us, the shaitan also knows about the instability of our hearts. And that's why the hadith says, مَا سُمِّيَ الْقَلْبِ إِلَّا مِن تَقَلُّبِهِ. That the qalb is referred to as a qalb because of its taqallub, because of its inconsistence. It's not stable. And the shaitan knows this. So he comes and he places his poison straight into your qalb, your soul, your spirit. Straight into your heart. And this comes in many versions. One is the abundance of doubt. And some people, what are some of the side effects of this disease? When they speak to you about a disease, they tell you some of the side effects. Some of the side effects of this disease, as narrated in the Quran and through the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, is that one, for instance, does not accept the testimony of other people. This is waswas. This is a disease from the shaitan. There are some who allow their doubts to override them. Everything is najis until it is proven tahir. Whereas in Islam, it's the exact opposite. كُلُّ شَيْءٍ لَكَ طَاهِرٍ حَتَّى تَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ نَجِسٌ. Everything is haram for them. Everything is haram until it is proven that it is halal. Whereas in Islam, it's the exact opposite. كُلُّ شَيْءٍ لَكَ حَلَال حَتَّى تَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ حَرام. Everything is halal, permissible, until it is proven through the Quran or through the Sunnah or through any authentic source that it is haram. But this disease, which we seek refuge in Allah from this disease, comes in this form, an abundance of doubts. Another disease also comes in the form of an abundance of desire. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran addresses this, He speaks first and foremost to the wives of the Prophet. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in Surah Al-Ahzab. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ya nisa an-nabi lastunna ka ahadin min an-nisa. O wives of the Prophet, you are unlike any of the other wives. Of course, two different readings. Ya nisa an-nabi lastunna ka ahadin min an-nisa. Some people stop here. But the more appropriate way is to continue. Ya nisa an-nabi lastunna ka ahadin min an-nisa'i in ittaqaytun. Meaning that if you have taqwa and you have piety, then you are better than other wives. Or else if you do not, then what is the use of being just the wife of the Prophet? What's the use of being just the wife of the Prophet? If you have taqwa. So for the wives of the Prophet who had taqwa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses them. He tells them that you are unlike any of the wives, any of the other wives. فَلَا تَخْضَعْنَ بِالْقَوْلِ فَيَطْمَعَ الَّذِي فِي قَلْبِهِ مَرَضٌ وَقُلْنَ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. He says, do not speak, because there were companions, men that would come to the house of the Prophet and they would treat the Prophet as if he was their buddy or their father or their brother, and his wives are just like their sisters and they can speak to them whenever they want. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاسْأَلُوهُنَّ مِنْ وَرَاءِ حِجَابٍ in Surah An-Nur. That if you have something to ask them, ask from behind hijab, behind a barrier. Do not approach them. In Surah Al-Ahzab, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the wives of the Prophet, when you speak, do not speak in a way which will bring about the desires of men. Do not make your voice in a way which is so soft, which will bring about the desires of men. فَيَطْمَعَ الَّذِي فِي قَلْبِهِ مَرَضٌ. There are people who have this marad, this disease in their hearts. And we're speaking realistically here. And this is why Islam emphasizes on hijab for both men and women, but more on women. Because there are some, realistically speaking, men, all they require is to hear the voice of a woman, and that brings about their desires. All they require is to smell the scent of a woman, and that brings about their desires. Realistically speaking, this is what the Quran tells us. This is why He says, do not make your voice in a way which will attract them. Why? He's telling them, as the wives of the prophets, who have taqwa, who have fear, it is your job to deflect negative attention as much as possible. You don't need that unwanted attention. Any Muslim woman, and any Muslim man of course, but more for Muslim women, does not need unwanted attention. So part of our hijab is not only covering ourselves, but to present ourselves in a way which will not attract unwanted attention. فَيَطْمَعَ الَّذِي فِي قَلْبِهِ مَرَضٍ. God says that there are some people among you, among the prophets, and among the wives of the prophets, who have a disease in their hearts. This is one type of disease. This is a second type of disease. And the third, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He speaks to Bani Israel in Surah Al-Isra. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَقَضَيْنَا إِلَى بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ فِي الْكِتَابِ لَتُفْسِدُنَّ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَّتَيْنِ وَلَتَعْلُنَّ عُلُوًّا كَبِيرًا. That we told Bani Israel, the Jewish people, the followers of Musa, that you will create corruption twice in the earth. وَلَتَعْلُنَّ عُلُوًّا كَبِيرًا. What was their sin? It was their arrogance. Now anybody who reads about Bani Israel in the Quran, how many times did they rebel against their prophets? They didn't follow the teachings of the prophets. Not only that, in some cases they killed them. They would murder their prophet, and Allah condemns them in the Quran. Take for example the story of Moses. Now you look at the Exodus. The Exodus is what? Is when the Jews, Bani Israel, when they left Egypt in order to go back to their homeland, Palestine. Although the Exodus represents their freedom from the tyrant, Fir'aun, but there was another test that was to come right after the Exodus, and that was to free themselves of the tyrants which were in themselves. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kept testing them. And this is mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah, the instance where Musa, alayhi salam, where he orders them, he tells them that God has commanded you to slaughter a cow, and تذبحوا baqarah. And this is why it's referred to as Surah Al-Baqarah, the longest surah in the Quran. So what did they say? It's a simple test. All you have to do, if you tell someone, a child right now, do this or do that, they don't ask you what color is it, or how big is it, or why do we have to do it. When they know it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, their response should be sam'an wa ta'atan. That's it. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to the good companions of the prophets. He says, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَنْ يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. That the mu'min, the believer, is he who when Allah and His Prophet command him to do something, he doesn't have an option to say, no, I'd rather not take this, I'll pass. He accepts it. But these people, they kept rejecting. And there's a reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kept sending them these minute tests. One was to slaughter a sheep. One is to wait patiently as Musa goes and receives the revelation and come back. And they kept disobeying the commands of the Prophet out of their arrogance. And what was the result? The result is that they stayed wandering, lost in the deserts for 40 years until they were able to go back to their homeland, to Palestine. Why? Because of their arrogance. وَلَتَعْلُنَّ عُلُوًّا كَبِيرًا. Now if you go back to history, when the commentators speak of the corruption which happens twice, لَتُفْسِدُنَّ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَّتَيْنِ وَلَتَعْلُنَّ عُلُوًّا كَبِيرًا. And then the following verses mention that because they were corrupt and deviant twice, that God sent to them punishment twice. Some commentators will say that it was the invasion of Babylon. Some will say that it was the invasion of the Greeks. Some will say it was the invasion of the Romans. But whatever it was, what we understand is that their destruction came from their arrogance. And arrogance is one of the diseases of the heart. وَلَتَعْلُنَّ عُلُوًّا كَبِيرًا. And I'm going to mention why the relationship between these people who lived during the time of Musa and those who lived during the time of the Prophet, and the very same tests, the very same form of tests which they were tested with, the companions of the Prophet were also tested with. A test of pride and arrogance and conscience. If you read about the history of the Old and New Testaments, the Revelations, what you will come to find is that the rabbis, the sages, the learned people of Bani Israel, after the revelations which were delivered to them by Musa, what did they begin doing? Many decades and centuries later, they began adding their own input and saying, this is the revelation of God. They began introducing their own stories. And even when it came time to the Prophet, there were people among the companions who would introduce, I recommend you read about this, Al-Isra'iliyat, which are what? Stories of Bani Israel, which were forged and fabricated by them, passed down from one generation to another. And subhanAllah, they even found their way among the Muslims, among the companions of the Prophet. Abu Hurairah used to narrate from Ka'b al-Ahbar, who was a Jewish sage who pretended to be Muslim, and he would poison the Muslims and the companions with these forged, fabricated stories. So this is what they would do. They would take the commandments, they would forge their own stories, they would add it to that, and they would refer to it as revelation. That's why when you look at the Torah today, the Old Testament and the New Testament, much of it is forged and fabricated, and it is not taken from the words of the prophets who are infallible. Rather, it is taken from them. And even when it comes to Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us of this. He says to the Prophet, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَلَوْ تَقَوَّلَ عَلَيْنَا بَعْضَ الْأَقَاوِيلِ لَأَخَذْنَا مِنْهُ بِالْيَمِينِ ثُمَّ لَقَطَعْنَا مِنْهُ الْوَتِينِ. That if this Prophet Muhammad, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, if he was to forge and fabricate anything from himself, what would we do? لَأَخَذْنَا مِنْهُ بِالْيَمِينِ. We would take away his what? His yameen, his right hand. Right hand means what? It's figurative. Yameen or ayman in the Quran, which literally means the right hand, refers to authority. Meaning if this Prophet was to take anything from himself, forge or fabricate and introduce it into Islam, we would strip him of his authority. He says this about our Prophet. It was out of their arrogance that they forged and fabricated the sayings of the prophets and attributed it to themselves. And to this day you find arrogance. Arrogance is a disease. Arrogance is a disease that plagues everyone. And when it comes to arrogance, you look at the actions of the companions of Musa, Bani Israel, and you relate them to the actions of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. You find many similarities. What did God order the companions of Musa to do? The first thing, after he freed them, was to slaughter a sheep. Something which is so simple. But they kept asking him, what is the color of the sheep? What does it look like? What's its size? What kind of milk does it produce? This and that. And they kept lagging. Why? Because they wanted to disobey the commands of Prophet Musa. It had nothing to do with slaughtering a sheep. Slaughtering a sheep, there's no significance to it. Or slaughtering a cow. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, لَن يَنَالَ اللَّهُ لُحُومُهَا وَلَا دِمَاؤُهَا وَلَكِنْ يَنَالُهَا التَّقْوَى مِنْكُمْ. That even this sheep that you slaughter during the days of Hajj, God is not going to benefit from its flesh and its blood. Where is the test? The test is a test of obedience and having a conscience. And the people of Musa, for the most part, they failed that test. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had them lost in the desert for 40 days. And that's why He ordered them to commit civil war. فَاقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ. Fight each other until the older generation are killed, they are extinct, and there is a new, fresh generation who is willing to obey by the commands of the Prophet and of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, when it comes to the companions of the Prophet. What does he say in the Quran? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Mujadala, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu. And this is just an example, one example. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, إِذَا نَاجَيْتُمُ الرَّسُولَ فَقَدِّمُوا بَيْنَ يَدَيْ نَجْوَاكُمْ صَدَقَةً. He says that, O you who believe, if you want to speak privately to the Prophet, I command you to give charity, sadaqah, before doing so. People would come and they would take up the Prophet's time, and the Prophet was a busy man. God wanted to test them with something very simple. Giving charity is something very simple. It may seem very simple, but it is a test of having a conscience. It is a test of obedience. Just like Bani Israel were tested. And so you find these people who all had their private matters with the Prophet. When this verse was revealed, subhanAllah, everybody forgot about everything that they had to do with the Prophet. All of a sudden, nobody has a private matter with the Prophet anymore. When the issue of sadaqah, giving a donation, everybody forgot about it. And then Allah tells them, أَأَشْفَقْتُمْ أَن تُقَدِّمُوا بَيْنَ يَدَيْ نَجْوَاكُمْ صَدَقَاتٍ. Was it really that hard? All I instructed you was to give sadaqah. Now you may ask ourselves, what's the significance behind this? Why does God require them to pay sadaqah? Or to what? To slaughter a cow. This is a test of obedience. This is a test to see who is going to be arrogant, like Bani Israel, or who is going to defeat his own arrogance. And the reason why it is relevant today is because when we look to our 12th Imam, Al-Imam Al-Hujjah, Hajjalallah Ta'ala Farajahu Sharif, when he arrives, the ahadith tell us that there will be people who, out of their arrogance, not ignorance, but out of their arrogance, they will tell him, go back. We have no use for you. We have the Quran, we have our instructions, our ta'aleem, and we've been living for hundreds of years without you. We don't need you anymore. This is a test of arrogance. Why do you think the hadith says 313 people? Some people are, am I one of the 313 people? Ask yourself. The 313 people will be those who, no matter how knowledgeable they are, no matter how famous they are, no matter how rich they are, they will destroy this disease which is in their heart, and that is the disease of arrogance. Look at those who fought the Imams of their time. Those who fought Imam Ali alayhi salam, were they ignorant? Were they people who were poor? Were they people who had no knowledge of the Quran? Or were they people who had memorized the Quran by heart, and who the narrations say that their foreheads had marks from prostration? But why? Why did they turn against their Imam? Their arrogance. They saw that they were superior to their Imam. So let us ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us in this holy month to rid ourselves of ignorance and to fill ourselves with humility and humbleness. And let us learn from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, those who were most humble, those who had the most humility. Imam Ali alayhi salam, when he was asked by a Jewish rabbi, a Jewish scholar, who was seeking the Prophet, a man came to Medina, a Jewish man came to Medina, and he was seeking the Prophet. He had heard from his elders that the Prophet will have this attribute and that attribute. One of his attributes is that he will have knowledge from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he'll be able to answer your questions. So he comes to Medina, he finds Fulan, and he begins to ask him questions. He realizes after a while that Fulan is not able to answer his questions. Fulan tells him, I will take you to a man who will be able to answer your questions. For now, he takes him to Imam Ali alayhi salam. And he begins to ask the Imam questions. And the Imam answers all of his questions very eloquently. So he tells him, are you the man that I am looking for, that I have been told about? Are you Muhammad? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. What does Imam Ali alayhi salam reply? Now think about this for a moment. There is no one at the time, other than the Prophet, who was as knowledgeable as Imam Ali alayhi salam. If anybody, let's be realistic, if anybody has the right to be arrogant, it is Imam Ali. If anybody has the right. What does he say? The man says, are you Muhammad? He says, وَيْلَكَ أَنَا عَبْدٌ مِّنْ عَبِيدِ Muhammad. I am but a slave of the slaves of Muhammad. This comes from a man who has dhamir, conscious. And this is what Rasulullah required. And this is what the Prophets required. People who had a conscience. That's why after the death of the Prophet, what could have the Imam done? A little known fact, and I will end with this. A little known fact is that Abu Sufyan, after the death of the Prophet, he went to the uncle of the Prophet, Al-Abbas. And Al-Abbas was loyal to Ahl al-Bayt, but he had his own masalih, his own benefits which he was looking after. So he went to Al-Abbas, he said, come with me. I have a matter to discuss with Ali ibn Abi Talib. He comes to him, he says, Ya Ali, Abu Sufyan says this, he says, Ya Ali, give me your hand and let me pledge allegiance to you. They can do what they want in Saqifat Banu Sa'ada, but I will pledge allegiance to you, and on your command I will fill Medina, I will fill Al-Madinah with the soldiers. And it'll be a military coup, and we'll take over. Now Imam Ali alayhi salam, if he was arrogant or if he did not have a conscience, he would have accepted. But he could see the mockery and he could see the trickery behind the intentions of Abu Sufyan. This is why not only did the Prophets require people who were conscious and obedient, but the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam also require those who are obedient and who are conscious. Let us ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this holy month to rid our hearts of arrogance, the disease of arrogance, so that we may be conscious servants of the Prophets, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, and la siyama also the Imam of our time, Al-Imam Al-Hujjah, Ajjalallah Ta'ala Farajahu Al-Sharif. Bismillah Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Allahumma aghfir lil-mu'minina wal-mu'minat wal-muslimina wal-muslimat. الأحياء منهم والأموات تابع بيننا وبينهم بالخيرات إنك مجيب الدعوات إنك قاضي الحاجات إنك على كل شيء قدير برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.